It's Shrovetide, the beginning of Lent in the old Tsarist Russia. A great annual fair is on. It's a popular fair. There may be the odd gentrified person slumming it a bit, but mostly it's the ordinary Russian people. It's a bright, clear day. I think you can hear that in the music. There's a suggestion of lively birdsong hovering above the texture on a flute. But also, it's early in the year, so it's probably pretty cold. Maybe you can get a suggestion of that too in the music. The freshness, the hard edges. At the same time, the air's beginning to fill with distinctive odours, the smell of horses, fried onions, tobacco, crowds pressed close together. Well, there's plenty of atmosphere there, but how is it conveyed? The music's full of what seem like pretty recognizable sound symbols. But the thing about sound symbols is they often tend to be vivid but ambiguous. Take that bird song I mentioned at the beginning. It could be bird song, but it could also just possibly be someone whistling or a child piping or some other sound of joyous, abundant life. There are other sounds that are still more vividly, particularly suggestive, things we might expect to find at a Russian Shrovetide fair. Here's someone playing a squeeze box, the kind of gigantic accordion the Russians called a bayan. Stravinsky imitates its mechanical sucking and blowing. And there's something more alarming, disturbing even. A peasant is leading a bear on a chain. He's piping shrilly. Stravinsky suggests this by using two clarinets playing together. The bear's anguished bellows can be heard on a tuba. The bear clearly doesn't like it. And note how Stravinsky suggests at the beginning the terrified crowd quickly scattering. There are gentler sounds too, though even here Stravinsky manages to suggest a kind of abrasive clash, the kind of thing that happens when people get together in large numbers. First, here's a solitary organ grinder setting up his pitch. But then, a moment or two later, we hear a woman playing a bright, tinkling music box, and the two play together. Harmoniously? Well, up to a point, but the rhythms of the tunes, the clarinet from the hurdy-gurdy and the glockenspiel from the music box, are ever so slightly out of phase. Then there are other sounds that are far harder to specify, and the score doesn't always help. Take this rustling, murmuring, clucking accompaniment to a Russian folk tune on an oboe. Now, the score says that's the introduction to the wet nurse's dance. I better explain that rather grotesque-sounding term. A wet nurse was a woman who was called on to provide milk for an infant, usually the daughter or son of a member of the gentry who wasn't up to the task themselves or a little too fastidious to do it themselves. But the accompaniment, that warbling, murmuring woodwind sound, what is it? It could really be basically just a sound of life, the kind of thing Nielsen loved to create, or Sibelius, or Mahler. Those are composers who are often able to suggest a kind of natural vitality without exactly telling us what it is they're evoking, just the sort of throb or pulse of nature. That's one of the great things about music, its dreamlike ambiguity, its double or even triple-sidedness of its symbols. And of course, these aren't just musical images. They're also musical themes to be developed in musical terms. So there's also another kind of double aspect to the music. How much of it is storytelling or scene painting, and how much of it is just a piece of music, developed as a piece of music. Still, there'll be some of you who know Petrushka from the familiar 1947 score who might have noticed the odd unfamiliar element, particularly when it's relative to colour. Well, the BBC National Orchestra of Wales and conductor Thierry Fisher are not using the familiar score, but Stravinsky's original 1911 version. The orchestra behind me are significantly larger. We've got 16 woodwind instruments instead of 12, and there's a slightly bigger, more colourful brass section. More about that later. We've also got a second harp. Now, that does make a practical difference to the kind of sound, but it also affects some of those sound symbols we've just heard. Like, for instance, that rustling sound, that murmuring sound with 4 bassoons and 4 oboes. In the familiar 1947 version, there's only 3 of each woodwind, so there has to be some mixing or doubling up, not to mention the added trumpets that Stravinsky adds in that passage. It's still effective, but the quality of the sound is different. I don't know about you, but I do miss that kind of smooth, warbling, pulsing sound of the original. There's a very special quality to that, hard to define, but very vivid. And do you remember that clashing organ grinder and music box passage we heard a moment or two ago? Well, there's an extraordinary sight in the orchestra, which is 4 hands squeezed onto one tiny Celeste keyboard. I can't think of another example of a Celeste duet like that in music. In the revision, Stravinsky takes out the glockenspiel and gives its tune to the Celeste, which is much reduced from its original 4-hand texture. That in itself is transferred to some little arabesques on a harp. In concert piece terms, it's a lot clearer. You can hear the textures and the lines much more distinctly. But something of that flavoursome comedy, the clash of 2 different kinds of instrument, is lost. On the whole, these changes are pretty subtle, but they do add up, and some of them are more distinctive. Take, for example, what's probably Petrushka's most famous tune, a little fanfare melody for the entry of one of the principal characters, the puppet of the ballerina. Here's a taste of the familiar 1947 version. The ballerina's fanfare melody played, as it usually is in the revised version, on a trumpet. What about the original 1911 version? Well, one of our brass players has been changing instruments. In 1947, we've got the fairly conventional 3 trumpets, but in the original, it's 2 trumpets and 2 cornets. The larger brass section also has a stronger colour instrument, a colour contrast, therefore, at this high level in the brass section. Now, the cornet is often considered a more vulgar, brassy, or indeed sentimental sound than the much purer trumpet, a much more thoroughbred instrument, you might say, in orchestral terms. It has what you might politely call a robust sweetness. Still, you'll note the change of colour when we hear that fanfare as originally scored for the cornet. We'll take it from slightly earlier, a little 3-note call from the cornet. You can imagine the puppet meister calling out, "Cue ballerina." Many thanks to our trumpeter-corneter Philipp Schatz there for deftly making the transition from one instrument to another that looks very similar, but actually isn't at all. In that version, the ballerina isn't so bright or pure as she is in the familiar 1947 score. She's slightly more brassy, you might say, which I think makes a rather nice point here. You see where I'm heading? Like a lot of people, I got to know Petrushka in the familiar 1947 revised version. But when I discovered the original, it felt like another dimension of illustrative power or flavour had been added to this music. It's the kind of thing Stravinsky later turned his face against. Music of itself can express nothing, was the kind of remark he liked to make. But it seems he felt differently in 1911, and that's highly relevant to his original conception here. And as far as I'm aware, Stravinsky never said that the revision superseded the original. If any of you out there know differently, I'd love to hear from you, but as far as I'm aware, he never said anything of that nature. And it wasn't just the flavour or the atmosphere that Stravinsky changed. He made it slightly more, I think the word I'm looking for is anonymous in the revision. There's something else he changed, more fundamental, and it affects the storyline. And for those of you who are wondering when I was actually going to explain the story of the ballet, here it comes at last. There's a kind of story within a story here, a scene within a scene. In the middle of all this crowded human life in all its raw Russian vitality is a puppet theatre. It's no ordinary puppet theatre. A magician comes on to the grotesque and slightly unsettling sound of bassoons and contrabassoon. There are some eerie washes of sound from the strings and the harps and the celeste. Then comes a kind of incantation, a spell on the flute. And weirdly, the puppets don't just seem to move, they actually appear to come to life. the puppets brought to life there by our flautist Andrew Nicholson. In the revision, Stravinsky removed the second harp and also the glockenspiel and toned down those washes of colour from the celeste. It's hardly fatal, but it does take something out of that magic spell, I think. There are three puppets here. There's the ballerina, who we've already met to her brassy tune on the cornet, and there's the Moor, a stock villain. One mustn't forget that racism was entirely acceptable in 1911 in a lot of societies. And Petrushka himself, well, he's a kind of sad clown puppet. His name in Russian means either Little Peter or Parsley, not exactly dignified. And as the music makes clear, it isn't exactly a dignified role that the puppets have to play now. All three of them enter to a kind of jerky dance. It doesn't sound quite real. Their strings are being pulled or jerked. Their movements are spasmodic, not exactly lifelike or human. Stravinsky uses the piano, his own instrument, to heighten that jerky effect. In fact, the piano is a very important soloist in Petrushka. There's some very beautiful writing for it, almost impressionistic in places, which is very untypical of the later Stravinsky, who liked to treat the piano as a percussion instrument. But in this passage, there's one solo which is very awkward to play. There are handfuls of chords in rapid succession, especially in this later solo passage. It's one of the most dreaded moments in the orchestral piano repertory. I'll ask our pianist Catherine Rowe Williams if she'd risk a brief demonstration. It may be dreadfully hard to play, but there's a brilliant sense there of that jerky puppet movement in that brief solo. We come to the end of the puppet show, but then it all begins to get rather strange. We enter the world of those 19th century masters of the surreal or the uncanny, like the German E.T.A. Hoffmann or the Russian Nikolai Gogol. We're not with the crowd now. The whole mood of the piece seems to take on a much more dream-like character. We're looking into the cabinets within the theatre where the puppets are stored. A door is flung open, and Petrushka is booted onto the stage. The door closes quickly behind him. Each movement is registered brilliantly, like one of those wonderful Scott Bradley scores for Tom and Jerry. Can't you just see it all there? I can. Now comes a very important motif on trumpets and cornets together, muted. They shrill out the motif of Petrushka's curse. We certainly get the message there, don't we? Interestingly, it's just that bit shriller with trumpets and cornets instead of just trumpets in the revision. Petrushka curses the boot that kicked him, and with it all the other forces that treat him as just a puppet. But this puppet is alive with real, powerful feelings. We learn more about these feelings when the ballerina saunters in. There are two very simple, almost nonchalant bars on the piano, and Petrushka is inflamed. There's a big crescendo. Then, as the ballerina leaves, the solo clarinet registers Petrushka's anguish. Again, we get the picture. There's real pain in that clarinet outburst, and it's underlined in the original. The notes for the clarinet and for the orchestra in that final poignant outburst are almost exactly the same in both versions. But in 1911, there's a marking, largamente, and also lamentoso assai, very lamenting. But in 1947, there's not even a hint of lamentoso and no largamente, no slowing down. Stravinsky even quickens up the last two notes. He changes them from quavers to semiquavers. It's as though the older Stravinsky is saying, don't linger, don't make too much of this. And whereas in the 1911 version the tempo is left to the clarinetist, there are no bar lines at all and the conductor doesn't beat. In 1947, bar lines are imposed on the music. The clarinet has to follow Thierry Fischer's beat. The effect is quite different. Stravinsky seems to have wanted it more metronomic, more like this. This change, this regularizing, this making the music more regimented in the 1947 version is very much of a piece with Stravinsky's later pronouncements on objectivity in music. We've heard him say that music can express nothing. He set his face firmly against all kinds of interpretation in performance. He insisted that he wanted his own music conducted like a metronome, as we've just heard in that revised clarinet cadenza. Many thanks indeed to our clarinetist Robert Plain for realizing Stravinsky's 1911 and 1947 versions so effectively. He seems to have wanted to eradicate from that clarinet passage any kind of interpretative bending of tempo, and the conductor has to be there to keep him in line. It keeps the action safely stylized, artificial, unambiguously puppet-like. No corny invitations to identify with the poor, forlorn puppet. But in 1911, Stravinsky clearly thought differently. He wanted pathos, like in his old score of The Firebird. Someone's found a piano score which is absolutely covered in emotional instructions to the conductor. That was only the previous year to Petrushka. Clearly, the older Stravinsky wanted to forget that he ever thought or felt like that. But the original score reminds us that he very definitely did, once. There's a similar change in expression in the passage just before, when Petrushka is left on his own after the ballerina's entry. There's a touching little piccolo and piano tune. In the original, it's marked dolente, lamenting, weeping almost. But in 1947, there's the much more neutral espressivo, expressive. And it's still more striking when we see the ballerina and the Moor dancing together, heightening Petrushka's pain and rage. In 1947, it's a trumpet and a flute. In the original, it's that brassy cornet and the flute. 1947 has the marking ben cantabile, well or nicely singing. But in the original, it's cantabile sentimentalmente, sentimental singing. Here we have a registration of Petrushka's emotional disgust, though as in the revision, it begins with the same limping bassoon accompaniment. It's almost as though we're invited to feel Petrushka's revulsion there at the sight of those two dancing together. Inflamed by this, Petrushka attacks the Moor, but the Moor easily wins and throws Petrushka out. Darkness falls along with the curtain. And suddenly we're out in the Shrovetide Fair again, with all those sounds of teeming, milling life. There's much use of Russian folk tunes here, some invented, some actually quoted, originals. The music builds to a huge climax. There's a sense of life almost bursting at the seams. The primal energy is almost too much. There's an ecstasy, if you like, in a kind of ancient pagan sense. We're looking forward here to the next ballet, The Rite of Spring. Listen to the way that Stravinsky exploits this particular folk tune. We'll hear it first of all played on its own by the violins and the cellos. Stravinsky combines that in a kind of elemental canon, an imitation between the cellos and the violins and the trumpets and cornets, with more of that whirling, murmuring, pulsating sound of life in the background on our full 16-strong woodwind section. Energy is terrific, exhilarating, and almost scary. We are close to the rite of spring. And this primal energy releases something dark, maybe, something dark in humanity, dark in the crowds assembled. A mummer dressed as the devil runs into the crowd, who begin to play along with him. There's a feeling that things could just get out of hand. Definitely a demonic element there, although it's still an element of play, the music manages to suggest. But meanwhile, something truly terrible seems to be happening off stage. Cries break through the texture on the trumpets and the cornets. The Moor chases Petrushka onto the stage, with the ballerina trying hard to hold him back. The Moor strikes Petrushka with his saber, and Petrushka falls, his head broken. Again, you can hear every movement registered in the music, to the tiny little tap on the tambourine at the end, where poor Petrushka's head hits the floor. You can see why Stravinsky is such a gift to a choreographer there. You just have to follow the music, basically, don't you? There's a moment of horrified stillness, and then Petrushka dies, shivering string tremolos and lamenting phrases on clarinet and bassoon. Again, it's fascinating what Stravinsky did in his 1947 revision. The clarinet and bassoon solos there are marked dolce espressivo and just dolce, sweetly expressive and sweet. But in the 1911 version, there's a much more pointed dolcissimo, as sweet as possible, and dolente, full of sorrow, weeping. We now approach the end. The magician drags Petrushka's body towards the little theatre. Then the motive of Petrushka's curse shrills out again on high trumpets as Petrushka's ghost rises high above the theatre and menaces the magician. The magician scuttles off in terror. That's a really unsettling end, isn't it? It's interesting that Stravinsky provided a different ending for concert performance, which, as a note in the score tells us, should be used, emphatically. No death of Petrushka. Instead, there's a trilling flourish and a noisy final chord. All ends still in the spirit of that Shrovetide fair. But interestingly, I've never heard it done. I gather that the BBC National Orchestra of Wales have done it once in a prom, but that must be a pretty rare occasion. And I can quite understand why, because disturbing though that end is, it's very, very powerful, as we've just heard. It leaves a strong aftertaste, doesn't it? Perhaps providing that concert ending was another one of these efforts, typical of that later revision of 1947, that Stravinsky made to objectify or to depersonalize Petrushka. It's as though he's saying, it's just a puppet, there's no real pathos here. It's still a brilliant score in that 1947 version, and very enjoyable. But in the original, it seems that something deeper comes out, something to do with a balance Stravinsky struggled for all his life and intensified later. Music of itself can express nothing, he's supposed to have said, and yet that same Stravinsky apparently shrank from hearing Tchaikovsky's Pathétique Symphony on the radio when he was on his own deathbed. What Tchaikovsky was expressing, it seems, was just too powerful for him. One of Stravinsky's most revealing remarks comes in one of those marvellous conversations with his amanuensis Robert Kraft. It's a passage where he contrasts his own manner with that of Alban Berg's hyper-expressionistic style in his opera Wozzeck. Passionate emotion can be conveyed by very different means, says Stravinsky, and within the most limiting conventions. He goes on to mention the medieval Persian miniature painters. They represent a different kind of ideal for him, he says. They were forbidden to portray facial expressions. In one moving scene, says Stravinsky, the artist shows a group of totally blank faces. The dramatic tension is in the way the ladies of the court are shown eavesdropping, and in the slightly discordant gesture of one of the principal figures. In another, two lovers confront each other with stony looks, but the man unconsciously touches his finger to his lips, and this packs the picture with, for me, as much passion as the famous crescendo molto in Wozzeck. So, is appearing masked as a puppet, rather like the kind of blank face those miniaturists painted, which still, nevertheless, conveys passionate emotion. Now, we're on quite dangerous ground here, but Stravinsky himself may have had reasons originally to identify with Petrushka. As he tells us in his autobiography, he was a bit of an ugly duckling as a child. He was very small and ugly, very unlike his handsome, brilliant, dashing older brother. In later life, he was obsessed with bodybuilding, apparently in some effort to compensate for his diminutive stature. Stravinsky tells us in his autobiography that his parents' preference for his glamorous brother above him, the runt of the litter, caused him a real sense of grief. So one wonders, did the younger Stravinsky actually identify with Petrushka, and in later life try very hard to cover his tracks? This is all too emotional, too confessional, too much like the kind of thing one associates with psychotherapy. Much better to present yourself as a stiff, upper-lipped, objective, Apollonian artist.